Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to stimulate thought, expand consciousness, and encourage community. I say encourage community because I believe that the vast majority of we humans are friendly tribal animals. And when we live in small enough communities in which we know each person by name or at minimum by face, we are collaborative and we sustain everyone in our community. Today on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, our guest will be Paul Austin. Paul will tell you about his experience with microdosing LSD and his creating the third wave. Check out the third wave on Google. I invite you to text or call in during the broadcast. Just tap in 650 tally ho. That's 650 tally ho. But first, before our stimulating interview, some news and notes in psychology and medicine. Question: is the ultimate fountain of life simply taking time to slow down? Our world, our country, our state, our county, our community, our neighborhood, and most, if not all of us, are going faster and faster in our daily lives. Runners, swimmers, and other athletes set new speed records. Baseball pitchers pitch faster. Tennis players hit balls faster. Computers and cell phones move faster and at faster speeds. Motorized vehicles regularly set new speed records. We have washers and dryers and toasters and coffee makers, all to get things moving faster. We have 1-minute managers and fast food. We push a button on a screen and items are delivered to our homes. Children want to grow up faster and people want to get there faster, wherever there happens to be. What effect does this cultural agreement on directing us to go faster, what does that have on our subjective experience of how much time we each have to live? Our subjective experience of the amount of time we live is diminishing? Is it diminishing? Do the days, weeks, and months seem to be going by faster? Are all your days merging into one? And if that be the case, what might we feel like if we created ways to reverse direction and begin living slower? Might we feel like we are living longer? Imagine going alone or with a companion on a slow walk, having a slow conversation, or taking a slow ride in the country. What would be the experience of purposefully parking your car far from where you're going and then slowly walking the rest of the way? What might it be like to purposefully eat and drink slowly? Imagine walking around your home slowly with intention on each step. If you resonate to what I'm saying, try a few experiments. Find a safe place to drive slowly and experience your visual perception of the environment at 10, 15, and 20 miles per hour. Create a day in your life which is cell phone and computer free, if you dare. What is your experience of being without your speedy cell phone and your speedy computer? Take time to be in nature. Look around. Rather than fast-moving images on screens, what makes up your view? Experience writing with a pen or a pencil and paper. See if you can make your handwriting artistic fun. Could it be that the ultimate fountain of life is slowing down the pace of modern life? I'd love to hear from you on this. Text in or call in at 650 tally ho. Now, let's meet today's guest, Paul Austin, and ask him what he thinks about slowing down as a mental health tactic. And remember, you are welcome to text in or call in 650-TALLY-HO. Paul Austin is an entrepreneur, public speaker, and educator who's been at the forefront of eradicating the stigma surrounding psychedelics, certainly a worthy cause. In 2015, Paul founded the Third Wave, which is dedicated to changing the culture and conversation around psychedelics. Inspired by his own early experiences with LSD and psilocybin mushrooms, Paul's personal mission is to help legitimize psychedelic substances through the lens of intentional and responsible use, ideally beginning at a microdose level. Currently, the Third Wave offers in-depth psychedelic guides, online courses, and one-on-one coaching working at the intersection of microdosing, personal transformation, and professional success. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Paul.
Thank you, Richard. It's an honor to be back on the show.
Great to see you again. It's been, 2 years or so since we talked on the Zoom before.
And what a 2 years it's been in psychedelic medicine since then. Before, I think last time we spoke, Michael Pollan's book had yet to be published, and that came out in mid-2018, and now there's dozens of companies coming into the psychedelic space. There's breakthrough therapy designation for psilocybin and MDMA. Oakland decriminalized, Oregon legalized psilocybin therapy. So it's just such an exciting area to be talking about.
There seems to be a renaissance going on in the psychedelic area, research, use across the board. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why that was sort of the impetus and idea behind this third wave of psychedelics, is we're really going through this resurgence of interest in these medicines. We as humans have been using mushrooms and ayahuasca and DMT and other substances for thousands and thousands of years. And they just, it seems like they're just finding their way back into global consciousness at the right time, and they're fulfilling a need for healing that so many millions and millions of people have. So it's such an honor to be at the forefront of this and stewarding conversations around, well, yes, these are powerful medicines, and how do we use them with intention, with responsibility, within a framework that leads to not only inner healing, but also external change and external healing in our culture and society.
I want to talk to you a lot more about the renaissance that's going on. But first, I'd like to go into a bit of a historical perspective, particularly for those who didn't hear our interviews in the past. I know I interviewed you here on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, and you interviewed me on your podcast as well. But if for those who haven't heard, let's have a little history lesson. Tell us about what got you into this whole thing and how you but how you decided to start the Third Wave, as I recall, back in 2015.
So I grew up in West Michigan, which is a fairly traditional part of the Midwest, quite religious. And I grew up in a more, liberal family. My mom's a feminist. My dad works in higher education, but also a quite religious upbringing.
What city in Western Michigan?
Grand Rapids.
Grand Rapids, okay.
Yeah, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And went to church every Sunday and, did that whole thing. And had to follow quite a few rules. And then when I was 16, I found cannabis and was like, oh, this is interesting. And then when I was 19, I started to do higher doses of LSD, anywhere from 100 to 200 micrograms of LSD, and anywhere from maybe 2 to 3 grams of mushrooms, excuse me.
When you were 19 years old?
And I was 19 years old. I'm 30.
And where were you? Where were you when you were 19?
I was in West Michigan. I was going to a college that was pretty close to where I grew up.
Okay.
In Holland, Michigan. And
Oh, in
You
Holland,
know,
Michigan, the
in
famous
Holland, Michigan,
for the great tulip
for
debacle.
the Tulip Time Festival. Yes, yeah. All those Dutch folks out there, and in those early experiences, as many of us experience, those of us who have worked with psychedelic medicine, we feel this incredible expansion, the sense of ultimate freedom, the sense of anything is possible, the sense of being able to create the life that we want to live. And so through those early experiences, I just started to dream up what would it look like to, especially for my 20s, to create an existence of total freedom where I could do what I want and go where I want and choose how I want to live. And made the choice at that point to go abroad and to travel. So I lived in Turkey for a year. I moved to Thailand and lived there for a year. And while I was in Thailand, I heard Jim Fadiman, who I'm sure you know well. And Jim Fadiman was on the Tim Ferriss podcast talking about microdosing. And,
Hmm.
I thought back to those early experiences that I had with LSD and remembered, for the week or the 2 weeks after those early experiences, I had this afterglow where everything just felt a little easier. I was making better decisions about the way that I connected with people, the food that I ate. I was starting to meditate a lot more. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, that would sort of dissipate and things would return back to somewhat normal with slight changes and differences. And this is what we call integration now.
Hmm.
And at that point in time, I had no lens for it. I just thought, oh, LSD is illegal. I feel great. It feels amazing. I'm having these beautiful experiences, but because it's illegal, it must be bad. And then when I started to get into, Jim Fadiman on the Tim Ferriss podcast, I started to get into microdosing and just read through the history of psychedelics and came to realize, oh, we've been lied to about these substances. They are, in fact, they're anti-addictive. They're incredibly beneficial for mental health. They have a long use of human history dating back thousands and thousands of years. And I just went and dove into a total psychedelic wormhole. I had studied history in college and in undergrad as my main thing. And so I just became fascinated with, oh, this is the context of psychedelic medicine and all of human history. And at that point in time in 2015, there wasn't really a strong online modern resource on psychedelic medicine. Whoops. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, keep going, Paul. Richard will be back in a second.
Okay. So there wasn't really a strong online resource about psychedelic medicine. There were a few websites, but they had designs from like the 90s, or they were maybe more for a countercultural crew. And I thought, hey, it would be so great if we start a platform and a resource around the responsible use of psychedelics and talk about microdosing within that, because with the anticipation of these are medicines that are going to become increasingly popular, and the best way to lead with it for many people who are new to psychedelic medicine is with microdosing, because higher doses of psychedelics can often be very threatening to the ego. People can be very intimidated by sort of jumping into the deep end right away. And so why not look at microdosing as a way to ease the sort of developmental process of working with psychedelics? And so that was back in 2015 that we started Third Wave. I had my own personal microdosing experience with LSD around that same point in time, where I microdosed with LSD for twice a week for about 7 months. Found it to be incredibly impactful. As I mentioned earlier, after a high dose, you have this sort of afterglow period for integration where things are a little bit more flowy and move easier, you're more present, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I heard about microdosing, I thought, oh, what a great way to extend the integration process. Are we still on? Are we still good, Richard?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay. Good.
I had a little trouble there for a while. I lost you.
Okay.
You never lost connection, did you?
No.
Okay, good. So
I kept talking.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. So maybe you better bring me up to speed. Are we out of Turkey and Thailand?
We're out of Turkey and Thailand. We started Third Wave as a platform about the responsible and intentional use of psychedelics. And the intention was, okay, psychedelics are really going to be, like what cannabis was. They're really going to hit sort of a mainstream population fairly soon. Let's create a platform and a website that educates a mainstream populace about the responsible use of psychedelics. And let's lead with microdosing as a topic, because that's a great way for people to start to work with psychedelics, to start to develop the skill of how to work with psychedelics, because that in itself is a skill that can be developed and cultivated. And that was back in 2015. And many things have happened over the last 5 years. In 2018, I also started a psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands called Synthesis, where we do legal psilocybin retreats. And now at Third Wave, we're really looking, how do we build and create the trusted platform in the psychedelic space? Because as psychedelics grow in popularity, I think the core challenge for a lot of people is, how do you find a clinic, a retreat, a therapist, a facilitator who you can work with, where you feel safe, who you can trust? And that's what we want Third Wave to become, is a community, a movement where clients and patients, or clients and coaches, or patients and doctors, or patients and clinics can meet each other and work together.
When we moved along in this quote drug war, the avenue towards legalization, which is analogous to using microdosing as a entree to psychedelics, was to focus on medicinal marijuana rather than recreational, because obviously it was obvious to me, going back maybe 30, 40 years or more really, that it was medicinal marijuana that was going to be the gateway to get us in the door. Because as soon as the population at large became aware of the medicinal effects of marijuana, there would be a great deal more acceptance. But we're still working on undermining the incredibly nefarious work of Richard Nixon, who did a monumental job of creating an association in the lives of America, an association between hippies and marijuana, and blacks and marijuana, and Mexicans and marijuana, and blacks and heroin, and Chinese and opium. And it was really Richard Nixon and his people that in fact, I have a quote from I guess it's Ehrlichman, admitting that they did this, and then saying at the end of his quote, do you think, did we know we were lying when we put it on the news every single night, night after night, hippies and marijuana, blacks and marijuana? Did we know we were lying? Yes, we did. And so they lied to the American public, but they told the big lie so often, as you well know, that they have instilled that in the culture. And now we have to do our best to reverse that and to educate the culture to the potential medicinal benefits. And I don't know if while we had a little break there, you talked about your personal story of what the microdosing did for you. But I remember from 2 or 3 years ago when we talked, that you told me the story about how you microdosed at a very early stage of learning about all this for 9 months in a row. You recall that story? I'm sure you do.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Would you mind telling that story again and the effect that it had on you? I think it's an important one, Paul.
Absolutely. So right around the time we started Third Wave, I started to microdose as well. So I had heard Jim Fadiman on the Tim Ferriss podcast in March 2015. And in May 2015, started to microdose, May or June, started to microdose with LSD twice a week. And the intention was twofold with microdosing. The first was to enhance the sense of flow and access to flow states. And flow is that sense of being in the zone. It's like when you're working on a paper or a project, or you're doing some creative brainstorming, or maybe you're going snowboarding. It's when the conscious mind, the self-referential mind, totally drops away and you're just in the zone and moving. And so what I noticed is that when microdosing with LSD both on the days that I would microdose, especially the days that I would microdose and the days after. It was just much easier to get into that flow state, which made creation and creating so much more lubricated. There was way less resistance on the pathway of creating. And so that was one big part.
Did you follow, let me interrupt for a second. Did you follow Fadiman's protocol that he suggests, which is 1 day on, 2 days off, 1 day on, 2 days off?
That was the protocol that I initially did for the 7 months, was 1 day on, 2 days off.
You stuck to the protocol
for those first 7 months. Yeah.
Okay.
I just was doing it 1 day on, 2 day off.
Okay.
And then the other intention behind it was to help with social anxiety. So, you know, in my early 20s and teens, I used alcohol and, you know, stuff like that to help with social anxiety. And what I noticed is that when I would microdose with LSD, I was just more open. I was more willing to connect. I was sort of less in my head and more present with people, and, you know, was looking to microdose to help with that process as well. And with both of those things, it was incredibly helpful, because ultimately what microdosing does, just like meditation, is it just helps you be more present. And when you're more present with what is, you're slowing down, as you talked about in the intro of this podcast, then there isn't near as much anxiety there. And when there's less anxiety, it's easier to connect, it's easier to create, it's easier just to go with the flow of life, rather than feeling like you have to sort of force something. And that's what microdosing more than anything taught me. And it wasn't just microdosing. I think that's also worth emphasizing. Throughout this period, I was also meditating consistently. I was getting out in nature. I was, you know, I had you know, in terms of the diet that I ate, the exercise that I was going through. Microdosing was just sort of that catalyst, that opener. But it was really about all the lifestyle changes that I also put into place.
Have you maintained those lifestyle changes now, 5 years later?
Yeah, they've just become integrated into who I am, in terms of the way that I connect with people. And, you know,
are they part of your life, the exercise and the nutrition?
Yeah, the nutrition, definitely. The exercise, yeah. I mean, I go through different phases. You know, lately I've been doing more capoeira, which is sort of a Brazilian dance thing. I've been doing a little calisthenics, a little jujitsu. Back in Chiang Mai, I was doing more CrossFit, heavy weightlifting. But that sense of, this is what I need to feel nourished, this is what I need to feel present, this is what I need to feel healthy, that has definitely become integrated and stuck. And that's, you know, I would say it's three main things. It's still these high doses that I do every now and then, whether it's ketamine or ayahuasca or psilocybin, you know, those.
All right, slow down for me a minute here. I need you to do an operational definition of high dose of each of those materials,
Okay.
Please.
So what's a high dose of?
Well, let's back up for a minute.
Okay.
Let's tell everyone exactly in MU, in micrograms, how you define a microdose.
And let's stick with LSD, because LSD,
Let's stick with LSD. How do you define a microdose?
So a microdose is going to be anywhere from 5 to 20 micrograms of LSD. My microdose amount is about 15 micrograms of LSD. And for everyone, it's a little bit different, because everyone has a little bit of a different physiology, and everyone is maybe a little less neurotic or a little more neurotic. So you gotta like titrate it. And that's, again, that comes back to the skill of microdosing, is what's that sweet spot for you. And you want it to be enough where you notice over a week or 2 weeks, as you're starting to microdose, you're more present, you're more easygoing. There might be more energy, there might be mood improvement, but you don't want it to be so much that you become anxious or that you start tripping, right? So you want to find that sweet spot with microdosing. And then the idea with microdosing is that the day you take it, is that it's sub-perceptible. And essentially what that means is you can do your normal everyday activities. You know, that could be work, that could be taking care of the kids, that could be going for a walk, that could be your meditation, that could be whatever it is.
You can be a
And you can
responsible citizen.
be a responsible citizen, but your mood is slightly enhanced. You have a little more energy. You're a little more creative. You're a little more present. And then over time, right? Let's say 30 days, if someone is doing a microdosing protocol where they're microdosing twice a week for 30 days, they notice, oh, at the end of those 30 days, I've seen all these shifts and changes. It's similar to when someone meditates every day for 30 days straight. You know, it's not like after day one, they're like, oh my gosh, everything has changed. But after that 30-day trajectory, they look back and go, I'm a little more patient. I'm a little less reactive. You know, I take a little better care of myself. I'm eating a little healthier. There are these small shifts that start to take place that lead to a healthier self.
Incremental changes. Now, over the 7 months of that initial experiment with microdosing, and you're saying your sweet spot you found to be 15 micrograms, did you notice any movement towards increasing the dose as the time went by, which happens so often with all kinds of medicines? Not all medicines, but many medicines. You know, it takes a little more and a little more and a little more to get there, or was the dose that you hit for a sweet spot adequate and stayed there pretty much for the whole 7 months?
Doing it just twice a week, there really wasn't any sort of short-term tolerance that was present. So consistently doing just 15 micrograms about twice a week, I didn't notice, for example, in month 4, oh, like I really need to start taking more if I'm going to feel the same effects.
Understood. Why did
I've
you
had,
stop? Why did you stop at the end of 7 months rather than make this part of your life forever?
I had to leave Thailand,
Okay.
and I didn't want to, I mean, this is the truth. I didn't want to travel with certain substances
Of
on
course.
my person while
Right.
I was going like international. So I thought, okay, I'll just leave this here. And then I think a few months later, I found myself somewhere else, maybe back in, where was I? I think I was in Mexico, maybe, and started to microdose again, just, you know, here and there. But having that break was great because I could then assess and evaluate, okay, I've been doing this twice a week for 7 months. And that's a lot more than Jim Fadiman recommends in that protocol. You know, what Jim talks about is do this twice a week for 5 weeks. And
Well,
see
he
how it
does,
feels.
but I want to point out to our listeners, you may already know this, that Albert Hoffman himself, now I haven't totally researched this, meaning I'm pretty confident, but I'm not 100% confident, where he says that for the last 20 years of his life, he took LSD every single day, and he lived to 102. So maybe you can find out more about that and let me know. But as best I've been able to find out, that's what he did. Now you wonder about serotonin depletion and various other neurotransmitters taking that kind of thing. So that's why we need to find out more. Okay, you told us what you call a microdose. You gave us an idea of what everybody needs to find a sweet spot. It's somewhere between 5 and 20 micrograms. I agree with you on that from my research, although I do have a few cases of people who take 30 a day because that's how they are. And when they take 20, it just doesn't go anywhere. They've titrated. A medical doctor friend of mine is in that category. But then when you get up above that number, you're into a slightly different space. You're really not into psychedelic hyperspace at 40, but you're moving in that direction, and that's not what we're talking about for microdosing. Now, I asked you to give me the operational definition of what you mean when you say you take larger doses of these various things. Take us through the psychedelics that you do use or have used and what you consider larger doses.
So I would say the commonality between all of them, whether it's ketamine, which is technically a dissociative, it's not necessarily a psychedelic, but it has psychedelic-like effects.
It
Whether
definitely
it's,
does if you inject it.
it does, yeah. Whether it's ketamine or ayahuasca or psilocybin or LSD, there's a sense of surfing consciousness. There's a sense of having a really big opening, of having a really big peak experience. And there can be visuals involved. There can be significant changes in perception. But I think that's sort of the feeling that one goes through. And then when it comes to the specific substance, they're all a little bit different, right? With ketamine, which is now legal, and you can go in and you can get ketamine injections or ketamine infusions, and do that with psychotherapy. It's called ketamine assisted psychotherapy, and it can be very, very helpful with depression and addiction and other things like that.
Yeah, here in
ketamine,
Paul, here in California, even Kaiser Permanente, one of the biggest hospital chains, they have a ketamine assisted psychotherapy program.
really?
Oh, yeah. And I'm pretty certain that people are able to use their health insurance for treatment with ketamine. Oh, yes. And
so that's
yeah. And we have some colleagues of mine, Genesee Herzberg and Jason Butler, two doctors, started a ketamine assisted psychotherapy institute for economically challenged people in Oakland called the SAGE Institute. You want to check that out sometime.
Yep.
I
SAGE
think
Institute is great.
Oh, you've heard about them. Yeah, great. So,
and there are all these that are.
So I want to talk specific numbers because people want to know, and we also want to refer them to Erowid, of course, where they can get specific information on dosage. Erowid is EROWID for you all listening. By the way, if you want to ask Paul a question, remember 650-TALLY-HO. So let's get back to numbers here, Paul. It's important.
So with ketamine, I've been doing it in lozenge form, and I usually do 300 milligrams of ketamine in lozenge form. And that's a lozenge that you put in your mouth and you swish around, and that leads to a largely disassociated state. And I'll usually put on a playlist and just go into it and surf in it. And I've been doing that with a company called Mindbloom, which does telemedicine ketamine therapy, where they now can legally send ketamine lozenges to your home, and you can go through a treatment program, which is perfect for COVID because many people are in quarantine, stuck at home. So for ketamine, 300 milligrams for lozenge form. For intramuscular IV, it's similar, I want to say 200 to 300 milligrams, but I haven't done that before. So ketamine has a few different things. With LSD, let's talk about LSD. LSD, a psychedelic dose, a high dose, is anywhere from 100 to, let's say, 500 micrograms of LSD. And you can go above that as well. Stan Grof, who we both know is a well-known psychiatrist who did LSD psychotherapy, would even give patients upwards of 1,000 micrograms of LSD if they were highly neurotic. But most people for high doses of LSD, it's anywhere from 100 to 500 micrograms of LSD.
I interviewed someone on this program a few weeks ago who typically takes 200 to 400, a psychoanalyst in New York named Winninger. And
Charlie.
Oh, you know Charlie?
I know Charlie. Oh, Charlie's great.
Well, Charlie told me he took 5,000 micrograms one time. I know, your jaw's dropping. So did mine. But I think he said it was an accident. He didn't. But maybe it wasn't Charlie Winninger. I shouldn't say that. Anyway,
the most that I've done is I think 400 micrograms of LSD. To do 5,000 would be.
Yeah, I think my highest number, and it was a long time ago, was 750. I've got a question here for you. One of our listeners says, when you're using the word tripping, Paul, what do you mean by tripping?
So the word tripping would be having a peak experience, having a high dose experience where there's changes in your visual perception. There's probably changes in your emotional perception. There might be a sense of ego dissolution that's dropping out of the way. There's a sense of enhancement of touch and sound and taste and all these other things. That would be sort of a typical psychedelic trip, if you will, a psychedelic experience. So
give me a rough guess now of how many times you've ingested a psychedelic material in your lifetime that you would refer to that experience as tripping. What's your total number, roughly?
Probably 60 to 70 times.
And
no, probably 100 times actually.
Okay, this is important. This is important data because the other day I was at a meeting and I was talking. One of the people at the meeting is a clinical doctor of clinical psychology in Madison, Wisconsin, And he said that he has taken large doses of LSD 900 times. And what I pointed out to the other person on the Zoom is that he is talking coherently. He looks like everybody else at the meeting. Everything he says is using regular logico-deductive wording. There's nothing unusual about how he looks, how he talks, and if you could smell or taste him, you could probably say the same. And yet he has taken LSD 900 times. That in and of itself is an extremely important piece of information. That's the reason I asked how many times. This wasn't just a trivial question. You have taken it 67 times, 60 or 70 times in large enough dose that you call it tripping. You've had, major changes in consciousness and emotional state. And yet, obviously, here you are, your faculties are functioning beautifully. You've got a great smile on your face, and, you're, quote, a regular person. That is extremely important because remember what we were fed for the last 53 years is that if you do this stuff, you're going to be jumping out of buildings, you're going to be standing on your head, you're going to be looking like a raving hippie in the Haight-Ashbury, and all kinds of other ridiculous activity. And it's obviously, as more and more of us come out of the closet about this, and I love what you're doing, it becomes more and more obvious to the public that all of that was hogwash. It was disinformation. Really, disinformation used to weaponize the media against certain people, mostly of color. That's really what it was about, mostly of color. And that's why our jails, as you know, are full of people of color, because the police then acted on that and put people away for it. And of course, you know how irritated, if not enraged, I am about this whole matter. And I'm going to keep talking about it probably for the rest of my life because it's outrageous. And until we do something and empty those jails and stop this activity, it will go on, right? It's part of what's called institutionalized racism. We're focusing on one piece of the institutionalized racism, which is weaponizing medicine against people, right?
And thankfully, I think it's worth emphasizing, Richard, that we're seeing more and more changes and shifts. We're seeing cannabis, in terms of cannabis becoming legal and psychedelics now becoming decriminalized, and Oregon as a state just decriminalized all drugs. I think Vancouver and the whole entirety of Canada is doing that. I just saw something about, I think New Zealand is decriminalized. So we're seeing those shifts, but it's still, we're only 10% there.
Exactly.
There's still a lot of progress in the next, but I'm optimist. I'm optimist. I'm
Yes.
an optimist.
Yes.
In that by the end of this decade, I think we'll have reached a significant tipping point in that war on drugs.
Well, that's part of what I love about you calling your program the third wave, because this is a wave. And by the way, let's take a little sidebar here and tell our listeners why you call your program the third wave and what the other two waves are before it from your perspective.
So the name, I want to talk about the name a little bit. Third wave of psychedelics, how it came about, because I think it speaks to what psychedelics help us to do, which is think creatively and think outside the box and think from an innovative perspective. And I was in Budapest at the time with two friends, and we were on LSD, a higher dose of LSD, not just a microdose. And we were talking about this is 2015, the resurgence of interest in psychedelics. And we were going to a third wave coffee shop. And third wave coffee shops are like the nice cafes where you can get a cappuccino with a swan, an artisanal swan on top, and they have single origin beans from Guatemala, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to these third wave coffee shops. We're talking about psychedelics, and we're trying to come up with a name of, well, what's going on? How do we sort of frame this resurgence of interest? And kind of we came up with this idea of, oh, this is the third wave of psychedelics. And then we're like, oh, that sounds interesting. Like maybe there's something there. And then upon reflection, as I started to read more and more about, like I said, I studied history in undergrad. I love history. As I started to read more about the history of psychedelic medicine, I came to recognize that oh, wow, humans have been using these substances for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so that first wave of psychedelics is sort of the classical an indigenous use of psychedelic medicine. So we could go, ayahuasca in the Amazon, which has been used for thousands of years. We could talk about kykeon, which was a beverage that was used in ancient Greece in the Eleusinian Mysteries, where Plato and Aristotle and all the major Greek thinkers and philosophers went. We could talk about soma, which is in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, this sacred brew that people would drink in ancient India that had mushrooms in it. So we've had this rich lineage, even in the Bible, the whole burning bush, Moses, it's likely that Moses was on something called Syrian rue at that time. And this hallucination that he had of the burning bush was from the plant medicine that he was taking. So when I started to go, oh, that's this first wave. So we have indigenous use, we have rituals, we have ways that we've learned to integrate these into different cultures and civilizations across the world. And then the second wave was the counterculture of the 1950s and 60s, but not just the counterculture. The second wave represented the first time that we had tried to use science to understand psychedelics, because for the first wave, it was just indigenous use. It was classical use. We didn't have sort of the modern scientific method to analyze psychedelic medicine. And then with the second wave, thousands of papers were published about the clinical use of psychedelics, LSD for alcoholism and LSD for social anxiety and LSD for depression. And there were thousands of papers. And unfortunately, things got a little, well, because of what happened with the counterculture and the hippies and the Vietnam War. And it felt like it was too much. There was a counterculture. It was against the mainstream culture. The counterculture was this, the mainstream culture was that. And essentially the mainstream culture was too strong at that point in time and said, hey, we gotta shut this down, which is where that quote from Ehrlichman comes from. They knew these drugs weren't harmful, but they had to discriminate against these people, the hippies and the blacks. And the best way to do that is just say, hey, the drugs they're using, let's make those illegal. Because we can't throw them in jail for being hippies or being black, but we can throw them in jail for using cannabis or using LSD or using heroin. And then this third wave of psychedelics is really looking at the integration of those two. How do we integrate the ritual and the wisdom and the knowledge from thousands and thousands of years of use with cutting edge scientific method to understand how do we use these substances with responsibility and with precision. And that started in 2006. Roland Griffiths published the first paper about psilocybin occasions mystical type experiences. And then over the last 15 years, there have been hundreds of papers that have been published. Michael Pollan published How to Change Your Mind in 2018. MDMA and psilocybin have received breakthrough therapy approval from the FDA. Denver decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms. Oregon legalized psilocybin therapy. And now there are millions, if not billions of dollars of investment that are pouring into the psychedelic space to totally upend healthcare as we know it, which I think is incredibly exciting. And so we're now at this point in 2020, towards the end of 2020, beginning 2021, where it looks like psychedelics will become legal medicine within 2 years in places like Canada and Oregon.
Yeah, there's hope that MDMA will become a prescription drug by that year.
By 2023 for PTSD, but you also have in Canada, psilocybin therapy could be legalized within the next year or two. And in Oregon, they just passed a measure by 2022, they'll have legal psilocybin therapy.
And
So
I think Oakland passed a similar law too, didn't they? The city of Oakland?
Well, Oakland decriminalized all of plant medicine. So
That's
they
right.
just made it the lowest law enforcement priority. But Oregon is actually creating regulations and standards for how do you train facilitators, how do you train therapists, who has access to psilocybin, who can grow psilocybin. So they're actually creating a legal framework for how we actually work with this in a therapeutic model.
Now, your organization, The Third Wave, which offers courses, in fact, our producer, Charlie Dice, just told me to remind listeners that there's a coupon of some sort that's associated called Mindbody 15. And if you sign on for one of Paul's courses in microdosing and use the coupon code Mindbody 15, you get a 15% discount. So check that out, listeners. Paul, your whole organization is about educating and teaching the use of an illegal substance. How does that go down with regard to the law? Are there eyes on you? Do you feel like you're being watched? How do you relate to that? How does your staff relate to that? Tell us what it's like running an organization that's all about educating people about an illegal substance.
When we started in 2015, which is more than 5.5 years ago now, I think it was September 2015. I initially, used a pen name, and I think it was Tom Williams, because I was concerned. I was like, if I come out publicly about this, who knows what might happen. And then about a year after that, I just changed to using my regular name, Paul Austin. And then about a year after that, I was speaking with Jim Fadiman, who had been on the Today Show. This was in 2017. And he was on the Today Show, and apparently there was a DEA agent who was also on the show to talk about microdosing. And the DEA agent essentially said that microdosing is the absolute lowest priority for law enforcement, because it's mostly being done by middle to upper class white people. There's no crime associated with it, so there's really no sort of attention and energy on it. And in a way, by focusing so much on microdosing, we are helping people through education. We're helping people to understand why actually taking fewer amount, lowering the amount that you're taking from a drug perspective is healthy and beneficial. So in a way, we're doing everyone's work for them. We're helping the government, who still thinks, maybe these are difficult or harmful drugs. And from their perspective, we're probably helping people to do this in a safe way and an effective way and doing it less. And from the eyes of people who are interested in this medicine and see it for what it really is, they see it as beneficial, and we're helping them with that framework as well. So at this point, it's been 5.5 years. I've never received a message from any sort of governmental agency. I've never been under surveillance, as far as I know.
As far as you know.
We have many team members, who have come through, and we have about 12 to 15 people on the team right now, and all of them feel, safe enough. And I think, especially with all the progress now around psychedelic medicine and the investment that's coming in, and the FDA approval in Oregon legalizing psilocybin therapy, and all these cities decriminalizing, it just feels like psychedelics are at the so-called bottom of the totem pole.
I'm sure you're aware that I think one or two companies recently had IPOs and have moved on. Psychedelic companies are on the stock market with some pretty serious funding behind them. MindMed, I think, is one of them, isn't it?
Yep, MindMed is one, and MindMed just hit $1 billion valuation. And then the other one is Compass Pathways, and Compass Pathways is on the NASDAQ, trading at, I think, $50 to $55 a share, and they're at a $2.3 billion valuation.
Quite significant.
Which is insane. I mean, it's very significant. And, a lot of the plays that people are making are biotech companies. And although, it will be many years until they have a revenue source, apparently biotech companies are valued based on the addressable market. And for mental health, that's hundreds of millions of people, and the efficacy of the clinical trials. And with psilocybin, as we all know, there's incredible efficacy at treating depression. And so I think that combination makes the psychedelic space a potentially $1 trillion market in the next 10 to 15 years.
So I want to talk now about two forks in the road. They don't really have to go in different directions. They can go in parallel directions. And that is, one is the use of psychedelic medicines for healing. And the other is the use of psychedelic medicines for creativity and advancement. And these are really separate, because the first one, you'd be a patient and you'd be going into some kind of a protocol, some kind of structured situation with a guide, and you would be treated as such for the particular condition that you had, such as depression with psilocybin. And the wonderful work that you referenced that Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins has done. And then there's a second track, and which is the track of creativity. And I'd like you to just sort of talk away about those two tracks.
So one track is really about healing trauma. It's about this process of becoming whole, of feeling like I can be present, I can be in my body, I can be with things as they come up. I don't live from a place of fear or anxiety or anger or shame. It's possible to drop a lot of the negative emotions and be more present, right? And that's where the vast majority of people who are interested in psychedelic medicine, that's the journey that they're on right now. They're healing trauma, they're becoming aware of things that have been repressed into the subconscious and the unconscious. And doing psychedelics within a therapeutic container then allows the sort of veil to be open and these traumatic memories to be processed and dealt with. So as like a specific example, the reason MDMA is so great at healing PTSD is because in normal waking consciousness, those who have PTSD can't actually talk about their traumatic experiences because it's so overwhelming. In particular, the amygdala, which is where fear happens, when someone who has PTSD in normal waking consciousness tries to speak about their traumatic experience, the amygdala tightens up so much, it contracts so much that they just can't do it. It's impossible. And so what happens with MDMA is MDMA softens the amygdala, allows the amygdala to stay basically chilled out. And then within a therapeutic model, that person who in normal waking consciousness can't speak about the traumatic experience, when they're on MDMA, they have a catharsis. And that traumatic experience can be brought out, it can be forgiven, it can be integrated. And then that doesn't continue to impact their lives from a subconscious or unconscious perspective. So I think that process, and that's why psilocybin is so great for treatment-resistant depression or alcoholism, is because oftentimes depression, addiction, anxiety comes from a core trauma, comes from an adverse childhood experience. And psychedelics help to heal that wound so someone can be present with whatever is going on with them. So once we reach that level, so to say, then it becomes possible to sort of expand and look at the whole sort of realms of human potential. And this is where Maslow, talked about self-actualization and how psychedelics can play a part in that. This is the research that Jim Fadiman and Willis Harman did in the 60s about LSD. What role does LSD and mescaline and psilocybin play in that creation mode? Because what LSD and all psychedelics are so great at is helping the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate with one another. And so when the two hemispheres of the brain communicate with one another, there's this process that happens called divergent thinking. And divergent thinking is when we take two ideas that don't seem to be related at all, and we come to recognize that there's a synthesis, there's an integration between those two ideas. So an example of this is when I talked about how we came up with the name of the third wave of psychedelics. We were talking about psychedelics, and we were on LSD in Budapest, and we were going to third wave coffee places, and all of a sudden, two seemingly totally disconnected ideas, psychedelics and third wave coffee spots, integrated into this new innovative thing because of what's happening in the brain and the mind. And in fact, in the 60s, Jim Fadiman did research on this, where he gave 25 people in Silicon Valley LSD and basically said, hey, like if you've had a problem that you've been trying to work on for the past 3 months, come to this session, we'll give you LSD. And all of these tremendous breakthroughs happened as a result of that. He had architects, he had engineers, he had managers who were coming with these big problems, and then they were able to find an innovative and creative solution to help with that process. And so in my own sort of personal experience with psychedelics, what I've noticed in that creation process is they really help with visioning. So when you're able to take a psychedelic, you're sort of, you go into a state of consciousness where you can observe everything that's happening without becoming attached to it, without becoming involved with it. And in that observation, let's say the 50,000-foot observation, you go, oh, this is interesting, and this is happening, and this is happening. And if you come in with a problem, so to say, or something that you want to solve, because those hemispheres of the brain are communicating really well, you can look at things from different perspectives, unique perspectives that you never would have before in sort of normal waking consciousness. And from my perspective, this is why psychedelics have become so popular in places like Silicon Valley. This is why Steve Jobs said LSD was one of the most important things that he ever did. It's why the computer revolution came out of Silicon Valley in the 60s, because all those people were doing acid who were involved in the computer revolution, because psychedelics can help you see things from totally unique angles and perspectives that you never would have thought of before.
When you said, you referenced now several times, going to that coffee shop with these friends. So you're saying that you went out in public and went to these coffee shops while you were on high doses of LSD. You were able to navigate, you walked down the street, or you went, did you actually go in a vehicle? How did you get there? Do you remember? And you're able to do such things. You know, this is beyond the imagination of most people when they hear, 200, 300, 400 micrograms of LSD, if they can relate to micrograms or things that they've heard. It sounds like, for the most part, you're going to be flat on your back or, sitting in a chair and watching the inside of your mind. And certainly if you, follow the great protocols, it's set and setting, and you want to, the last thing you might want to do is be on a crowded street or sitting in a coffee shop. So tell us a little more about that. I see you.
Yeah. So those are like two different. So I was with friends in Budapest for a week, and during the week, we were going to like different third wave coffee shops. And then on a specific day, we woke up at like 6:45. We took about 250 micrograms of LSD each. And then we called an Uber. And the Uber brought us to a park that was overlooking all of Budapest, that was overlooking the Danube. And it was like a beautiful park where we then just sat in a beautiful meadow, us three, watching the shifts and everything happening. And then as part of the integration process, later when we're walking around, we're kind of reflecting on, oh, that was such a beautiful experience that we had on this high dose of LSD. And we're drinking a coffee, sober again.
I think
just
that's
reflecting on it. And that it's good to clarify that, Richard.
Very good to clarify that. Very much so. Because the next thing you know, there will be sound like we're both saying,
we don't want to do that.
No, we don't want to do that.
Use.
I've got a text here from a listener, Paul.
Okay.
How is microdosing different from current prescription drugs? Couldn't you get hooked on it and then be paying the big new companies an annuity rather than paying big pharma annuity? How will it be any different?
So there are a couple key differences.
That's a great question, by the way.
It's a really good question. Most pharmaceutical or psychotropic medications are addictive. So if you start taking them, as anyone who has taken an SSRI before or an anti-anxiety medication before can attest to, once you start taking them, it's very, very difficult to get off of them. Very difficult to wean off. Whereas with microdosing, LSD or psilocybin, you can microdose 2-3 times a week for a month and then stop cold turkey. You're not going to have any sort of withdrawal symptoms. I think that's the first key significant factor. The other key element.
Wait a second. Let me stop you on that one before we go on to the other key element, but hold that thought on the other key element. How can we know that the microdosing, after enjoying its benefits for a certain amount of time, doesn't put a hook in? For after all, if I'm this way and here's my baseline, and all of a sudden I take a little of this, whatever it happens to be, and there are no negative consequences that I can see whatsoever, why would I not want to take a little of this on a fairly regular basis As I said, possibly Hoffman himself took it for every day for 20 years. We're going to find out more on that. But why would one not want to? And therefore, just because there isn't withdrawal from stopping doesn't necessarily mean that a hook isn't in, because it can be a different kind of hook.
Or maybe it's not a hook. Maybe it's like taking fish oil, or maybe it's like meditation, or maybe it's something healthy that's nourishing, just like you would take a prebiotic, probiotic, or just like you would, go for a morning walk in the woods. What's to say that we have to view microdosing as negative if we take it consistently, and why not view it as something that enhances everyday life?
Well, that's a point well taken, but we still,
relationship with it.
I think that's a good point you're making there, that you could see it as taking a vitamin on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have to deal with the listener's question of paying for it and who gets the money. And one of the beautiful things that we saw on I guess it was on television last night with Ling.
Lisa Ling.
Did it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lisa Ling. She did that program, and one of the things I was pleased to see that she pointed out is how easy it is to grow psychedelic mushrooms, because
Exactly.
that's the ultimate answer to the listener's question about paying Big Pharma the annuity, which is to grow it yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful part about mushrooms is there will be companies, probably when it's legal, Third Wave will produce a microdosing supplement, and we'll have the microdosing supplement with other great herbs like ashwagandha and rhodiola and lion's mane. Like we'll create something, a nice formulation. And if someone wants to support us because they want to purchase it, we would love that. That would be great. That supports our mission. So I think there's a way to engage with businesses where it's not like, you don't see it as a negative thing if you're getting medicine from them. And there's definitely the opportunity to grow your own mushrooms. In fact, I think what we're going to see in the next year or two is there will be a company that will just come out with some innovative little box that you can buy at home.
That's right.
You can stick in your closet. You spray some water on it a couple times a week, and within a few weeks, you'll have your own mushrooms that you can then grind up and use as medicine. So that's where I go. Maybe if someone is microdosing LSD for ADHD and LSD becomes an approved treatment for ADHD, then there's the whole pharmaceutical issue. But I think for most people, they can either grow their own mushrooms, they could purchase a formulation like a supplement formulation that's reasonable, or they can make friends with someone who grows their own mushrooms and get their medicine from a local grower. I think all of those are ways to step outside of the sort of pharmaceutical industry way of, kind of overcharging and keeping people hooked and kind of that whole mentality.
Yeah, I think we have to reframe the way we look at the particular ingestion of the substance. Here's another question that just came through, Paul. What is the worst example of abuse of psychedelics you have encountered, and what do you attribute it to? The drug itself or other factors? That's a great question. I like that question. The worst example of psychedelic abuse of psychedelics you've encountered, and what do you attribute it to? The drug.
Probably
Go ahead.
I would say probably the worst general abuse is when facilitators, and you see this in ayahuasca circles, and you see this elsewhere as well, when facilitators use psychedelics for sexual reasons, we could say. And this was, there was a documentary on Netflix about the Bikram guy who did this with yoga, or any guru mentality. If someone gives up their power within a situation, then psychedelics, what they do is they increase something called suggestibility. And that's really helpful for behavioral change, because if you increase suggestibility, you're making it much more likely that you can change your behaviors. Unfortunately, what that also does is it makes people much more susceptible to harm, potentially, if they're not in a safe container. And so that's why it's so critical and so key that if someone is intending to work with psychedelic medicine, that they know without a shred of doubt, the clinic or the retreat or the provider that they're working with is very safe. And that has less to do, I think, with the psychedelic medicine, and it has more to do with the fact that the person who is hosting the experiences is, you know, psychopathic or a narcissist or has a personality disorder or, you know, anything like that.
A predator.
Predator.
Actually, I think it's a combination, the way you describe it, and I think you described it accurately, Paul. It's a combination of both the drug and the other person, because as you said, these medicines, some of them make us more suggestible. So that's what the medicine brings to the table. And then that other person takes advantage of one of the references of the medicine, namely the person's in a suggestible state, and they take advantage of it. So you need, both things are happening concurrently. And this is a very important part of this program, because listeners need to know about the importance of what we refer to as set and setting, what your mental set is as you go into taking one of these medicines, and what the setting is. And the setting, of course, is critical. And the setting is not on the street, and it's not a party setting, and it's not with people you don't know. The setting is typically, in the way Paul and I are talking about it, particularly for use with mental health issues, the setting is with a guide who is guiding your way, who is caring for you, and who's a professional person. As you get more and more sophisticated, the use of a guide can be a friend, and it can be a person who is trained to be a guide, not necessarily a doctor. All of that works so long as it's still someone who knows what they're doing and is familiar with the territory. But we're certainly not saying that these things are to be used cavalierly. And what Paul's pointing out, which is so important, is that when you have a combination of suggestibility and a predator, you have a lethal combination. Very dangerous. And we have seen, for the listener who asked this, yes, we have had some examples of it, and it really tarnishes the entire field when that happens. And those of us who are really fostering responsible use, medicinal use, and the use for creativity. And I certainly want to always come back to that these medicines are not just medicines to treat something. They also happen to be medicines that foster creativity, enhancement of the self, growth of the self, expanded consciousness, and they will be able to be used for all kinds of scientific experiments. And one of the ones that I'm most interested in, Paul, that we haven't talked about in the past, is that I think psychedelic medicines will be the tools for epigenetics. I believe that psychedelic medicines, when used over a period of time with skill training, will teach us how to go inside and make internal changes. I believe that psychedelic medicines are the tools that will teach us, will allow us to teach ourselves, that's a better way of putting it. They will allow us to teach ourselves how to make presently involutional activities volutional. And the example I use is that when we get a cut on the back of our hand, we may just put a little something on it, but we have a total expectation that over a period of days, that cut is going to heal. And it does. And a scab is formed. And then we have an expectation the scab will fall off. It does. And it may leave a little mark. And over time, that little mark may go away, or it may be there faintly. But who did that? There's only one person in the world that did that, and that's us. When I get a cut, I'm the one who healed that. But I don't know how I did that presently. I can't tell you that I can focus my mind and make that happen slower, faster, or any other rate than the rate that it goes. And yet, I must acknowledge that I did that healing. Certainly you didn't. Nobody outside of me did. Therefore, there's the only person left that could have done it is me. So then the question I ask is, how do I learn to take control of that activity? And once I do learn how to take control of something simple like a cut and healing a cut, how do I then take that skill inside and go into my pancreas or my liver or my kidney or my heart and make internal repairs using the focusing of the mind? And that's where, for me, the big action is, Paul. The big action is in that epigenetic change so that I can make internal changes to my system as I'm going about my life. And I look forward to that. Oh, here's another person somebody wants to ask you about your course. Can Paul tease what people can expect in the course? Give us a tease, Paul.
Yeah, we teach like the skill of microdosing more than anything. So the basics of this is how you titrate your dose level. This is how you find your precise dose level. We talk a lot about the lifestyle changes. So we talk about meditation. We talk about breath work, yoga, like what are so if microdosing is the catalyst and the opener, what are the different lifestyle changes that you're integrating so you can be more present? And this gets back to the previous question. We don't want microdosing to be the magic pill. We don't want to give up our power to microdosing. We want microdosing and psychedelics to be that opener, to recognize that capacity is innate. It lies within us to heal and to transform and to be creative. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the course. So the basics of how to do the actual microdosing, the protocols that you do it with, but then also what are the lifestyle changes that we're making as a result of our microdosing experience, so we don't have to be dependent on it if we don't want to be.
Yeah, you've anticipated the next question, and you did it beautifully. The next one was speak to the skill of psychedelics, not a magic pill. And that's what you're saying, that it isn't a magic pill. What it is it's a facilitator for allowing us to create our own magic. And creating our own magic is also a skill, and that's what you're teaching in the course, because it's all about, and this is the similar thing I ran into during my 10 years with the chemical dependence. When I ran the Coke Enders Alcohol and Drug Program, and changing from a chemically dependent person to a free person is about all those lifestyle changes that you reference. There's no one thing. You don't just quit. You don't just all of a sudden stop. And if lying was part of your activity as a chemically dependent person, you don't learn how to stop lying overnight. It takes skill training over time, practice and practice, along with those other things of becoming a balanced person. And that's what it's about. The other thing that I love about the psychedelic experience is that it calls for interpersonal and intrapersonal honesty. There's something very honest provoking about the experience. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, it helps you look at things from an objective perspective because of the ego dissolution properties. So when you get the ego out of the way, the ego is that protective mechanism of the personality. And when that's dropped, you can just fully be with things as they are and see things in full truth. And it can sometimes be very difficult. It's not always easy to see truth, but it's very healing to see things as they are, the honesty part.
Paul, people are listening. If not to this program, they're listening to your podcast. If not to the two of us, they're reading books. You referenced Pollan's book. There's my book, Psychedelic Medicine. I really think, if I may put it this way, that Pollan's book, my book, and Jim Fadiman's book are the trio of importance, because Pollan talks about the personal experience. I talk about with the scientists, and Jim Fadiman is the recipe book. And so we cover the bases with those three, right? You've got the recipe, the scientists, and the personal experience. And so more and more people are going to be seeking this experience. And they'll be coming to you for a place to go. They'll be looking in their own neighborhoods for a place to go. What kind of caveats do you offer people? What should they be looking out for in order to stay safe? And what kind of money should they be spending so that they don't get gouged by people who would abuse the finances of this? What can you tell us about that, please?
Well, for anyone who's interested in working with this, as we talked about earlier, ketamine assisted psychotherapy is now legal. And so there are many places that will offer ketamine assisted psychotherapy. So I think that's one, the first consideration. When it comes to mushrooms, when it comes to sort of working with these substances, it's always wise to either grow them yourself or to have a trusted friend or network that you know where you can get these substances. And if you don't have any of that, there are many sort of psychedelic societies. And with COVID right now, there's fewer and fewer sort of in-person events, but there are a lot of communities that have popped up around psychedelics. And so I think it's worth just starting to look at who can you connect with, who can you develop and cultivate relationships with, who also have this same interest, to start to build that sense of trust. And this is what we're doing with Third Wave. You know, our intention is to build a community and a platform about, you know, responsible and intentional use of psychedelics, where people can find you know, they can find trustworthy education, and they can find a facilitator or provider who they can work with in a trustworthy way. And so I would say the intention in all of this is, you know, just go to Third Wave, and it's called thethirdwave.co. We have an email list that people can sign up for. We send out a newsletter, and just start to get involved there. And as someone becomes more involved in that, you know, we can help guide that and Sherpa them along this path of healing and transformation.
Paul, all of these substances were made illegal by a government out of control, and a government weaponizing the laws against certain people. As a result, the cost of these substances is created in great part by the risk taken by those who supply them. So, for example, here in California, as marijuana became legal, the price dropped, because after all, marijuana, which grows out of the ground, probably shouldn't cost more than cauliflower. But it was selling for $400 or more an ounce at one point, and that is because people are paying for the illegality, for the risk, and so on. Is the same true? And this is where we're going to wrap up. We're going to wrap up talking about with your comments about the money. Always follow the money. Will the price of these substances for one hit of MDMA or one microdose and so on, will it drop dramatically once these medicines are made legal?
It depends, you know, it depends on which state someone is in. It depends on, you know, a lot of the expenses for this medicine, for, let's say, MDMA assisted psychotherapy. It's not necessarily the drug that costs a lot, but it's the hours and the service of the therapist who you're working with. So I think the substances themselves, whether it's MDMA or psilocybin or LSD, will always remain fairly inexpensive, you know, relatively inexpensive. But the sort of cost in this is the quality of the therapist or the coach or the practitioner or the doctor that you're working with, and what their hourly rate is for being there with you as you go through this experience.
So you're paying for the guide
rather than the drug itself. I mean, the drug will cost money, but it will be negligible in comparison to the expense of a guide or a doctor.
So I just got a note from our producer, Charlie Deist, and he wants me to once again mention your coupon code to give you a plug here, Paul. So remember, everyone, when you go to the Third Wave and sign up for Paul's great course, put in the coupon code mindbody15. Anything you want to say in parting before we wrap this up, Paul?
Just that I'm very appreciative that we could have this conversation again, you know, revisit it a few years down the line and get the latest updates. And there's been so much progress since that point in time. And like I said earlier, if people need support on their path, if they're looking for a community to start to engage with and interact with, just to go to the Third Wave, which is thethirdwave.co. We have a course, we have a private forum, we have a newsletter list, and just start to look at ways to become involved that way. Because I think the key with all of this, psychedelic medicine and healing, is the sort of connection that comes from community.
It's about connection. And in that regard, Paul, let's you and I stay connected only forever. And when you get to California, please get in touch. Let's get together in person and do some talking.
I would love that, Richard.
And thank you all for joining me for today's broadcast of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. And special thanks to my producer, Charlie Deist, who makes this broadcast possible. This preceding program was brought to you by Thanksgiving Coffee. The founder of Thanksgiving Coffee, Paul Katzeff, is a social worker and political activist who has improved the lives of millions of coffee growers around the world. Paul so much appreciates Mind, Body, Health, and Politics that he created 3 special blends of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics coffee. 3 blends. He donates 20% of all his internet sales of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics coffee to the COVID Response Network, a nonprofit 501c3 whose mission is to protect California's North Coast from COVID. Go to the Thanksgiving Coffee Company website, buy Mind, Body, Health, and Politics coffee, support Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, and support the COVID Response Network. Please, listeners, join me next Tuesday at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time for our next stimulating broadcast of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. Until then, this is Dr. Richard Lewis Miller reminding you that good health is worth fighting for, and it is essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.